$500 is a real number. It's a mortgage payment for some people, a month of groceries for others. And right now, millions of people are spending it on a Windows laptop without ever asking whether that's actually the smartest move for how they use a computer. Not because Windows is bad, not because they've thought it through and decided it's worth it, but because Windows is the default and defaults don't get questioned. They just get purchased. I've spent the last several weeks running this comparison as honestly as I know how. Same tasks, same workflows, same user types. And what I found is that the answer isn't what the Windows side of the internet wants you to hear. And it isn't what the Linux evangelists want you to hear either. It's more useful than both. Let me show you exactly what the numbers and the real-world experience actually say. Let's start with what you're actually getting when you hand over $500 for a Windows machine. Because the spec sheet and the lived experience are two different things. At the $500 price point in 2025, you're typically looking at a machine with an Intel Core i5 or AMD Ryzen 5 processor from the current or immediately prior generation, 8 GB of RAM, which is increasingly the floor rather than a comfortable baseline for Windows 11, a 256 to 512 GB SSD depending on the brand and configuration, and a 15-inch 1080p display with brightness in the 250 to 300 nit range. Names in this bracket include the Acer Aspire 5, the Lenovo IdeaPad 3, and the HP 255G10. These are real functional machines. I'm not setting up a straw man. But here's what the spec sheet doesn't tell you. Windows 11 on 8 GB of RAM in 2025 is a compromised experience. Not broken, compromised. 2 GB depending on background services and installed software. 5 GB for everything you actually want to do. Open Chrome with 6 tabs, a PDF, and a Spotify stream running simultaneously, and you are at or near the ceiling. Task switching slows. The system reaches for the page file, which means it starts using your SSD as emergency memory, and performance degrades in ways that don't show up on a spec sheet, but show up constantly in daily use. The 256 GB storage situation compounds this. Windows 11 itself consumes roughly 30 GB at installation. Add the recovery partition, the manufacturer's bloatware, which on budget Windows laptops can run to 15 or 20 GB of pre-installed applications you didn't ask for and may not be able to fully uninstall. And you are starting your ownership experience with somewhere between 180 and 210 GB of usable space. That's before your documents, your photos, your downloads folder, or any applications you actually install yourself. For context, the average user's photo library alone exceeds 50 GB according to data published by Backblaze in their 2024 Storage Trends Report. And then there's the performance trajectory. A $500 Windows laptop in year 1 feels acceptable. In year 2, after cumulative Windows updates have added background services, after the antivirus subscription that shipped with the machine has expired and been replaced by a free alternative running alongside Defender, after the browser has grown heavier and the apps have updated to versions that assumes more RAM, that same machine feels slower, not because anything broke, because Windows is a system that accumulates weight over time, and budget hardware doesn't have the headroom to absorb that accumulation gracefully. If you've ever owned a mid-range Windows laptop and found yourself thinking it felt noticeably slower after 18 months, you weren't imagining it. You were experiencing a documented pattern. Here's where the $500 number stops being honest. Because the purchase price and the total cost of ownership on a Windows machine are not the same figure, and the gap between them is larger than most people expect. Start with the software layer. Windows 11 Home ships without Microsoft Office. It ships with a trial or web-only version of Microsoft 365, which converts to a subscription at around $70 per year if you want the full desktop applications. It ships with an antivirus trial, typically McAfee or Norton, that expires after 30 to 90 days and begins aggressively prompting for a subscription that runs between $40 and $80 annually. Windows 11. Home also does not include BitLocker full disk encryption in the traditional sense. That's a Pro feature, and Pro costs an additional $100 as an upgrade license, or comes on machines that start closer to $700. So the true cost of a reasonably equipped, reasonably secure Windows 11 home laptop over a 2-year period, hardware, plus Office 365, plus a security suite, or Defender plus cloud storage, because OneDrive's free tier is 5 GB, which is functionally nothing, lands somewhere between $700 and $900 depending on your choices. The $500 laptop is a $500 entry point, not a $500 total. Now compare that to the Linux side of this equation. A Linux desktop, and I'm specifically talking about installing a current Linux distribution on existing hardware or on an equivalently priced machine, starts at $0 for the operating system. LibreOffice, which handles the overwhelming majority of document, spreadsheet, and presentation tasks that Microsoft Office handles, is free and open source. Full disk encryption is built into the installer on every major distribution at no additional cost. There is no antivirus subscription market on Linux in the consumer sense, not because Linux is magically immune to all threats, but because the architecture and market share combination makes it a significantly lower value target for the malware ecosystem that drives Windows security software sales. Arrow 4, LTS or Linux Mint 22, does not follow the Windows pattern of accumulating background weight. A well-maintained Linux install on the same hardware in year 2 typically performs comparably to year 1, and in some cases better as driver support matures. Security researcher and Linux advocate Brian Lunduke documented this total cost of ownership disparity in a detailed analysis published on his Substack in 2024, calculating that over a 4-year hardware lifecycle, the average Windows home user spends between $400 and $600 on software subscriptions beyond the hardware cost. That's not a fringe calculation. It's consistent with what you get when you add up the receipts. Think about that for a second. You may have already spent the equivalent of a second laptop in software costs over the life of your last machine without ever adding it up. All right, let's run the actual comparison. Not benchmarks on a spec sheet, but the 6 categories that determine whether a computer works for a real person's real life, and I'm going to give you a straight verdict on each one. Category 1, everyday performance on equivalent hardware. This one goes to Linux, and it isn't particularly close. 2 gigabytes of RAM depending on the desktop environment. Linux Mint, with the Cinnamon desktop, sits in a similar range. 2 gigabyte idle footprint on the same hardware, and the math is straightforward. Linux leaves dramatically more headroom for the things you're actually doing. On an 8 gigabyte machine, that difference is felt constantly. On a 4 gigabyte machine, which still exists at the budget end of the market, Windows 11 is borderline unusable for modern browsing, while Linux remains functional. Independent benchmarking published by Forenix, which has been running cross-platform performance comparisons since 2004 and is the most rigorous ongoing source for this data, consistently shows Linux outperforming Windows on identical hardware across CPU-bound tasks, file system operations, and multitasking scenarios at the budget tier. Verdict: Linux wins. Category 2, software availability. This is where the honest conversation gets complicated, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The Linux software ecosystem in 2025 is genuinely excellent for productivity, development, media consumption, casual gaming through Proton and Steam, and creative work in certain disciplines. But it has real gaps. Adobe Creative Suite, Photoshop, Premiere, After Effects does not run natively on Linux. Professional audio production software, like Pro Tools, is Windows and Mac only. Certain enterprise line of business applications, specialized academic software, and games with kernel-level anti-cheat like Valorant and certain EA titles either don't run or run with significant friction. If your workflow depends on any of these specifically, Linux as your primary daily driver is a genuine obstacle, not a minor inconvenience. If your workflow is a browser, an office suite, email, video calls, media playback, and general productivity, which describes the majority of home users, Linux covers it completely, and does so with a software library that has matured significantly in the last 3 years. Verdict: Windows wins for specialist software users. Linux is sufficient and often better for general users. Category 3, setup and learning curve. Windows wins here for most people, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. A new Windows laptop powers on, connects to Wi-Fi, creates a Microsoft account, or can be coaxed through local account setup, and most people can navigate it from day one because they've been using it their whole lives. Linux installation has improved dramatically. Ubuntu's installer is genuinely accessible, and the out-of-box experience on Linux Mint in particular is designed specifically to ease the transition from Windows. But driver compatibility for newer or more obscure hardware, occasional Wi-Fi or Bluetooth quirks, and the simple reality of learning a new environment create friction that a first-time Linux user should expect. That friction typically resolves within 1 to 2 weeks of regular use, but it is real. If you set up Linux for someone and leave them to figure it out alone, the experience varies significantly by hardware and comfort level. Verdict: Windows wins on initial accessibility. Category 4, privacy and data control. Linux wins this one clearly and structurally. A standard Linux distribution does not have a built-in telemetry pipeline reporting your usage behavior to a corporation. It does not have an advertising identifier. It does not reset your privacy settings after an update. It does not require an online account to function. The relationship between the user and the operating system on Linux is fundamentally different. You are running software, not participating in a data collection arrangement. For users for whom this matters, and after the last several years of Windows telemetry disclosures, that group is growing, Linux's structural advantage here is not a marginal improvement. It's a categorical difference. Verdict: Linux wins, and it's not close. Category 5, gaming. The gap has closed substantially, but Windows still holds the edge for serious gamers. Steam's Proton compatibility layer has made a remarkable percentage of the Steam library playable on Linux. ProtonDB, the community compatibility database, shows over 80% of the top 1,000 Steam titles rated as running well or perfectly on Linux as of 2025. But that remaining 20% includes some significant titles. And outside Steam, the situation is patchier. Net all have varying degrees of Linux support, ranging from functional with effort to not supported. If gaming is your primary use case and your library spans multiple launchers with competitive online titles, Windows is still the path of least resistance. If you're a Steam primary gamer who plays single-player and co-op titles, Linux is genuinely viable. Verdict: Windows wins for multi-platform competitive gamers. Linux is viable for Steam primary gamers. Category 6, long-term value. This is where the total picture comes together. A $500 Windows laptop running Linux. Yes, you can buy the hardware and install Linux on it, which immediately changes the economics entirely. Or a similarly priced machine purpose-chosen for Linux compatibility delivers a system that performs better at purchase, degrades more slowly over time, costs nothing in ongoing software subscriptions for core functionality, and gives you meaningful control over what the operating system does with your data. The same hardware under Windows, factoring in the software cost stack and the performance trajectory over a 2 to 3 year ownership period, is a more expensive and in many respects more limited experience. Verdict: Linux wins on long-term value for the general user. Quick note on who this comparison may not apply to. If you're in a managed IT environment where Windows is required, if your professional workflow depends on Windows-only software, or if you're purchasing a machine for someone who needs immediate familiarity with zero transition friction, these are real constraints, and Windows may be the correct answer for your specific situation. This comparison is for the general home user making an honest spending decision, not a universal prescription. The real king isn't an operating system. It's the setup that costs you the least and delivers the most for the specific way you actually use a computer. And after running this comparison honestly, the answer is clearer than you might think. For the general home user, the person who browses, streams, manages documents, handles email, makes video calls, and occasionally edits photos, Linux on a $500 machine or on hardware they already own is the stronger choice by almost every metric that matters over time. Better performance on equivalent hardware, no ongoing software subscription costs for core functionality, meaningfully better privacy architecture, a system that doesn't slow down under its own weight over an 18-month ownership cycle. For the gamer with a multi-platform library, the creative professional inside the Adobe ecosystem, or the user whose workflow is tied to Windows-specific enterprise software. Windows remains the more practical choice, and no amount of Linux enthusiasm changes that calculus. What I'd push back on is the assumption that Windows is the sensible default and Linux is the risky experiment. When you run the numbers honestly, hardware cost, software cost, performance over time, privacy trade-offs. Linux is actually the conservative choice for the majority of home users. Windows is the familiar choice. Those aren't the same thing, and conflating them has cost people real money for a long time. The $500 question deserves a $500 quality answer, not a default. Now you have one. If this helped you think through a decision you've been sitting on, subscribe. I do these comparisons without affiliate deals or sponsored hardware, so the verdict is always the honest one rather than the convenient one. And drop a comment telling me where you land. Are you a Windows holdout with a real reason? A Linux convert who made the jump, or someone finally considering it? I read all of them, and the conversations in the comments on these videos are genuinely some of the best on the platform.